a seat in first class. The airport terminal buzzed with its usual chaos, but at Gate 17, Sergeant Leah Matthews sat still, her uniform immaculate, her heart racing. Her boarding pass read, Seat 2A, First Class, an unexpected upgrade. When a man confronted her on board, scoffing at her presence in the luxurious cabin, Leah's calm resolve met his ignorance. "I've earned this seat," she said. As turbulence shook the plane and tension escalated, Leah's strength, not just as a soldier but as a human being, shone through, forging an unlikely connection with a grieving passenger. But there's more to this story. Let me know where you're reading from in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to catch the next chapter in Leah's journey. Leah. The airport terminal buzzed with life. Echoes of boarding announcements mingled with the rolling hum of suitcase wheels and occasional bursts of children's laughter. Leah Matthews sat at Gate 17, her posture a blend of disciplined composure and quiet exhaustion. She wore her crisp desert camouflage uniform with boots polished to a mere shine, a habit, not a choice. Her name tag caught the glare of the fluorescent lights, Sergeant Leah Matthews. Her boarding pass trembled slightly in her fingers, not from the chill of the air conditioning, but from something deeper, an uneasy mix of anticipation, weariness, and lingering apprehension. At her feet lay her olive green duffel bag, its strap frayed from years of service and countless miles. Inside, she carried only the essentials, a few changes of clothes, a notebook, and a small photo of her unit, the family she'd relied on for the past 6 months. Leah's eyes wandered over the bustling crowd, business people in tailored suits, tourists snapping selfies, families herding children, and exhausted travelers slumped in their seats painted a scene of organized chaos. She caught a few glances in her direction. Some were curious, others respectful, and a few indifferent. It was the indifference that stung the most. Her thoughts drifted elsewhere. Home. The word carried a bittersweet weight. 6 months of sand, danger, and loss. Finally, I'm going home, just one flight away. Each syllable echoed in her mind, heavy with memories she wasn't ready to confront. A sudden announcement interrupted her reverie. Now boarding first class, flight 237 to Chicago. Leah glanced at the ticket in her hand, reading her seat assignment again. 2A, first class. She frowned, flipping it over as if the back might explain the unexpected upgrade. First class? That can't be right, she thought. Did they upgrade me? Must have been a mistake. No way I'll question this luck. She stood, hoisting her duffel bag over her shoulder, and made her way to the gate. Her boots echoed softly against the polished tile floor. As she passed a seated couple, their whispered conversation caught her ear. Man, huh? First class. Doesn't look like she could afford that. His companion nudged him sharply, hushing him with a glare. But it was too late. Leah had heard every word. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She wasn't new to this. Judgment, assumptions, stereotypes. They came with the uniform. Exhaling, she muttered under her breath, her voice barely audible. Sergeant Matthews, you've faced worse. At the gate, she handed her boarding pass to the attendant, who smiled warmly. Welcome aboard, Sergeant Matthews. Seat 2A is just to your left. Leah nodded, her face composed as she stepped onto the jet bridge. Inside, though, her thoughts churned like a sandstorm. The truth was, Leah Matthews had faced more in 6 months than many endure in a lifetime. She had joined the Army straight out of high school, seeking structure and purpose after a turbulent childhood in a small Indiana town. Her father, a retired mechanic, had raised her and her 2 brothers alone after their mother left. Money was tight, and opportunities were even scarcer. But Leah had grit. She wasn't afraid of hard work, and had dreamed of seeing a world beyond the cornfields and rusting factories of her hometown. The Army had given her that, and so much more. For 6 grueling months, Leah had been stationed at a base deep in the Middle East. enduring blistering heat, sleepless nights, and the unrelenting grind of service. She had forged bonds stronger than family with her unit, but had also witnessed unimaginable losses and trauma that haunted her. And now, I'm going home, she reminded herself, just one flight away. The rest of the journey was for Kent. Yet, even the thought of home felt bittersweet. Her brothers had moved away, starting families of their own. Her father's health had begun to decline. And then there were her own ghosts, shadows of comrades she'd left behind on the battlefield. Leah didn't know what awaited her in Chicago, but it was the closest thing to home she had left. Her boots made muted thuds as she stepped onto the plane. The scent of leather and faintly perfumed air greeted her. First-class passengers were already settling into their oversized seats, sipping complimentary drinks and flipping through magazines. Leah glanced again at her boarding pass, double-checking her seat assignment. As she stowed her duffel bag in the overhead compartment and lowered herself into seat 2A, a quiet sigh escaped her lips. The seat was plush, impossibly luxurious, worlds apart from the deafening metal bench seats of military transport planes. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to relax, sinking into the comfort. The boarding process droned on around her, passengers shuffling down the aisle. Leah adjusted her uniform subtly, aware of the occasional glances in her direction. She closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing, trying to quiet the restless thoughts in her mind. But the calm didn't last. A sharp voice cut through the low hum of conversation. "Excuse me, miss, you're in my seat." Leah's eyes snapped open. A man in his 50s stood before her, dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his polished shoes gleamed, rivaling the shine of her boots. His posture was rigid, his gaze skeptical and unyielding. For a moment, Leah felt tension ripple through her body, a reflex honed by years of training. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and met his gaze with calm determination. "Leah, this is my assigned seat, 2A. The man scoffed, his eyes flicking to Leah's uniform with a look she recognized all too well. Disdain, disbelief, and a flicker of something uglier. "Man, look, I've flown first class for years. People don't just get upgraded into these seats." Leah's grip tightened on the armrest, but she refused to take the bait. Instead, she calmly reached for her boarding pass and held it out, her hands steady. "Leah, sir, here's my ticket. Feel free to confirm it." The man hesitated, then snatched the ticket as though expecting to find it forged. He scrutinized it, his brow furrowing, but before Leah could say anything further, a flight attendant approached. Her professional demeanor was underscored by a subtle firmness in her voice. "Flight attendant, is there a problem here?" The man turned to her, his voice rising with indignation. "Man, yes, there's a problem. This woman is in my seat. I paid top dollar for first class, and she doesn't belong here. You need to fix this." Leah felt a wave of heat climb her neck, but kept her composure, her expression unreadable. The flight attendant glanced at Leah's ticket, her response calm but unyielding. "Sir, the ticket is valid. Sergeant Matthews has every right to this seat." The man's face flushed, his irritation barely contained. "Every right? What does that even mean? Are we just handing out first-class seats now?" Leah inhaled deeply, her jaw tightening before she spoke. Her voice was low but resolute, every word deliberate. "Leah, sir, I've earned this seat. Whether it's a mistake or not, I'm not moving." The cabin grew quieter as murmurs rippled through the nearby passengers. Leah caught fragments of a whispered conversation from across the aisle. Again, she listened to the other passengers. Is this really happening? She's a soldier. The tension was thick, the man glaring at Leah as if expecting her to back down. But she didn't flinch, her steady gaze daring him to push further. The flight attendant stepped in once more, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Flight attendant, sir, if you're unable to take your assigned seat, we may need to assist you off the flight." The man stiffened, his indignation now tempered with discomfort. After a long moment, he thrust Leah's ticket back toward her and stalked off toward his seat, muttering under his breath. Leah exhaled slowly, the heat in her cheeks cooling as the flight attendant leaned closer. "Sorry about that, Sergeant. Let us know if you need anything." Leah nodded, her voice quiet. "Leah, thank you." As the flight attendant walked away, Leah sank back into her seat. The weight of the moment lingered, but she pushed it aside. She had faced bigger battles than this, and won. Isaac. Finally, the man relented, muttering curses under his breath as he moved to another seat. Leah exhaled slowly, her fingers unclenching from the armrest. Her heart still raced, but outwardly, she remained calm. She turned to the window, the first-class luxury feeling less comforting now. As the plane prepared for takeoff, her thoughts wandered back to the desert, the faces of her unit, and the weight of everything she carried. The first-class cabin had felt like another world when Leah first stepped in. Polished floors, leather seats, soft lighting, and the faint aroma of citrus and lavender were a stark contrast to the diesel fumes and metal benches of military transport planes. A flight attendant greeted her warmly as she boarded. "Welcome aboard, Sergeant. Seat 2A is just to your left." Leah had nodded politely, her military-issued backpack slung over one shoulder. The bag's worn edges seemed out of place in the gleaming cabin, but she found her seat with practiced efficiency, sliding the bag into the overhead compartment before settling into the wide, plush chair. For a fleeting moment, she let herself relax. The leather seat enveloped her, and the softness was a jarring contrast to the unforgiving steel of C-130 benches. Her fingers brushed the edge of a neatly folded blanket, a small luxury she hadn't known in years. As other passengers boarded, their murmured conversations filled the cabin, accompanied by the rustling of luggage. Leah could feel glances in her direction, not hostile, but curious enough to make her adjust her uniform, smoothing the creases and tugging at her jacket. She turned her focus to the window, watching the muted orange glow of the setting sun spread across the tarmac. She closed her eyes, trying to center herself. Her breathing slowed, and the background noise began to fade. But the peace was short-lived, broken by a sharp voice slicing through the hum of the cabin. "Excuse me, miss, you're in my seat." Leah's eyes snapped open to find a tall man standing over her. His suit was pristine, his tie perfectly knotted, and his polished shoes gleamed as if freshly buffed. Despite his polished appearance, his expression was sharp with impatience. Leah straightened slightly, instinctive discipline guiding her posture. "This is my assigned seat," she said evenly. 2A. The man's eyes flicked to her uniform, his lips pressing into a thin line. His tone carried disbelief. "This is first class," he said, as though explaining an obvious mistake. "There must be some error." "Jeff?" Leah felt a familiar heat rise in her chest, but kept her voice calm. She reached for her boarding pass, holding it out to him with steady hands. "Sir, this is my ticket. Feel free to confirm it." The man snatched the ticket, his brow furrowing as he examined it. His skepticism was written plainly across his face. Leah wondered fleetingly if he might rip the ticket in frustration. Before the situation could escalate further, a flight attendant appeared at Leah's side, her expression composed but firm. "Is there a problem here?" the attendant asked, her professional tone unwavering despite the tension. "Yes, there's a problem," the man said, his voice rising. He jabbed a finger toward Leah. "This woman is in my seat and I paid for first class. I suggest you sort this out." Leah felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the instinctive bracing for conflict. She remained silent, her expression calm, as the flight attendant addressed him with unwavering composure. "Sir, the ticket is valid," the attendant said, her tone firm but professional. "Sergeant Matthews is assigned to seat 2A. The man's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "Are we just handing out first-class seats now?" Leah's grip on the armrests tightened, her knuckles whitening, but she didn't look away. "I earned this seat," she said, her voice steady and measured. "And I'm not moving." The cabin fell into a tense silence, broken only by the faint murmurs of other passengers who had begun to take notice. Leah caught snippets of whispered conversations and felt the weight of curious eyes. Finally, with an exasperated sigh, the man relented. He muttered something under his breath as he stalked further down the aisle. Leah exhaled, her body sinking back into the seat. The flight attendant offered her a brief but reassuring smile before moving on. Turning to the window, Leah gazed at her faint reflection in the glass, framed by the fading sunlight. The luxury of the first-class cabin, with its polished surfaces and soft leather seats, felt hollow now. Her fingers brushed the armrest absently, but her mind was elsewhere, back in the desert, with her unit, and with memories she couldn't shake. The man's face reddened, his frustration bubbling over. "Every right?" he repeated, his voice rising. "Are we just handing out first-class seats now?" Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Leah caught snippets of words, "soldier," and "ridiculous," among them, but she kept her focus on the man. Her heart pounded, but her outward demeanor remained composed. "Sir," Leah said, her tone steady, "I've earned this seat. Whether it's a mistake or not, I'm not moving." Her words hung in the air, firm and resolute. The man's mouth opened as if to argue, but his gaze shifted, taking in the eyes of passengers now watching intently. Across the aisle, a woman whispered to her companion, loud enough for Leah to hear, "Is this really happening? She's a soldier." The man's expression tightened, frustration giving way to reluctant acceptance. With a sharp exhale, he relented, muttering something Leah couldn't make out. He turned stiffly and moved down the aisle, his posture bristling with indignation. Leah released a slow breath, her grip on the armrests loosening. The flight attendant, who had stood by quietly, offered her a brief, reassuring smile before walking away. The cabin gradually returned to normal, the murmurs fading as passengers resumed their conversations or turned back to their own distractions. Leah shifted her gaze to the window, letting her reflection blur into the orange glow of the tarmac below. The confrontation left a faint residue of frustration, but it wasn't unfamiliar. Over the years, she had learned to carry herself in the face of assumptions, whether veiled or overt. Still, the experience stung, a sharp reminder of how quickly people judged based on appearances. As the engines roared to life and the plane began to taxi, Leah closed her eyes, centering herself. She was one flight away from home, one step closer to leaving the past 6 months behind. But the man's words echoed faintly in her mind. "Every right?" Her jaw clenched briefly as she pushed the memory aside. She had earned her place in ways he could never understand. Letting the vibration of the plane beneath her anchor her thoughts, Leah resolved not to let the encounter define her journey. Minutes later, as the plane ascended, the city below shrank into a patchwork of lights and shadows. Leah leaned her head against the cool window, watching the horizon blur as the plane climbed higher. She didn't know what awaited her in Chicago, but she wouldn't let anything, or anyone, undermine her sense of worth. The engine's hum deepened as the plane leveled off. Leah's thoughts lingered on the man's scoff and the disbelieving glance at her uniform. It wasn't the first time she'd faced such a reaction, but it still lingered, sharp and unrelenting. Why does it still sting, she thought, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. It was a question she'd asked herself before, one without an easy answer. Inhaling deeply, Leah reached for her backpack in the overhead compartment. She retrieved a small battered notebook and a pen. Companions that had traveled with her through countless miles and memories. Turning to a blank page, she hesitated, the pen hovering over the paper. It felt heavier than usual, as though burdened by the weight of her thoughts. Finally, she began to write, her words forming deliberately. "Dear Sir, you don't know me, but I'd like to change that." The cabin seemed to fade around Leah as she wrote, her focus narrowing to the notebook in her lap. Her sentences began cautiously, measured and deliberate, But as her thoughts flowed, they gained momentum and took on a life of their own. She wrote about things she rarely spoke of, about a world most people could barely imagine. She wrote about her deployment, 6 months of sandstorms that stung her face, days blending into nights under the relentless sun, and the sound of distant explosions that became disturbingly familiar. She described the camaraderie of her unit, a patchwork family bound by duty and necessity. Different places, different backgrounds, it didn't matter. They had each other's backs, no questions asked. Leah paused, her pen hovering above the page, as her thoughts drifted to Maria, her best friend and the person she trusted most in the world. Maria's infectious laughter and unshakable optimism had been a beacon, even in their darkest moments. Leah could almost hear her voice now, teasing her about something trivial, lifting the weight of their reality with a single joke. Her grip tightened on the pen as the memories turned darker. She wrote about the day everything changed, the ambush, the chaos, the searing heat of the explosion. Maria had pulled Leah to safety, shielding her from the worst of it. But Maria hadn't made it out. That loss, intertwined with guilt and gratitude, had stayed with Leah every day since. Her hand trembled as she put those words to paper, the rawness of the memory breaking through her usual composure. For a moment, she stopped writing, her vision blurring, as tears welled in her eyes. She blinked them away quickly, glancing around the cabin to ensure no one had noticed. "You gave everything, Maria," she thought. "The least I can do is honor you by staying strong." Leah's pen resumed its steady movement, her sentences gaining strength. She wrote about the sacrifices her unit had made. Not just the ultimate ones, but the smaller, everyday ones. Missing holidays, birthdays, and the simple comfort of being home. She described the bond they shared, one that transcended the divisions so common outside the military. In the letter, Leah explained all of this, not as an apology or plea for understanding, but as a way to bridge the gap she had seen in the man's eyes. She wanted him to see her not just as a uniform, but as a person with a story, struggles, and scars. Her words became resolute as she approached the conclusion. "You don't have to agree with me, and you don't even have to like me, but I hope you'll try to see me, not as someone who doesn't belong, but as someone who's earned her place in more ways than one. Maybe then, we can both leave this flight with a little more understanding." Leah set the pen down, her hand aching from the intensity of her writing. She stared at the letter, her chest tight, but her resolve steady. Putting her thoughts into words felt cathartic, a way of reclaiming something momentarily taken from her. Folding the letter neatly, she slipped it into an envelope tucked in the front pocket of her notebook. She held it for a moment, her fingers tracing its edges. This wasn't just for him, it was for her too, a way of confronting the sting that had lingered far too long. Leaning back in her seat, Leah tucked the envelope into the side pocket of her bag. The cabin returned to focus. The soft murmur of voices, the occasional clink of glasses, and the steady hum of the plane. She let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since she'd boarded. As she gazed out the window, the clouds below stretched endlessly, mirroring the journey ahead. The letter was written, but the story wasn't finished. Not yet. Suddenly, the cabin shuddered violently, the plane trembling with unexpected force. A collective gasp rippled through the passengers, followed by the metallic clatter of unsecured items shifting on tray tables. Leah's grip instinctively tightened on the armrests as her training kicked in, urging her to remain calm. Her muscles tensed, but she forced herself to take a deep breath, grounding her thoughts. A nervous voice broke the tense silence from a few rows back. "Is this normal?" the passenger exclaimed, his tone high-pitched with fear. Leah scanned her surroundings. The first-class cabin, so composed just minutes ago, now buzzed with unease. Across the aisle, a businessman fumbled with his seatbelt, his hands trembling as he tried to secure it. The flight attendants, though maintaining calm professionalism, moved briskly through the cabin, checking overhead compartments and reassuring passengers. Leah's attention shifted to the elderly woman seated beside her. The woman's knuckles were white as she gripped the armrests, her wide eyes darting nervously toward Leah. Her lips moved, but the whispered words were inaudible. Leah leaned closer, her voice soft but steady. "It's okay," she said gently. "This happens sometimes. Just breathe with me." She demonstrated slow, deep breaths, exhaling steadily to model calmness in the chaos. Leah watched her intently, looking for emotional reactions. None seemed to be there. The woman hesitated, her breathing shallow and rapid. Leah gave her a small, encouraging nod. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. Like this. You're safe." The woman followed Leah's lead, her breaths gradually slowing as her trembling subsided. Leah placed a steadying hand on the woman's shoulder, offering silent reassurance. Just as the tension in Leah's immediate space began to ease, another voice rang out, sharp, impatient, and unmistakable. "Professor, this is unacceptable," bellowed the man from earlier. His tone carried indignation as he waved dismissively at the cabin around him. "Don't they train pilots for this? How hard can it be to keep a plane steady?" Leah turned her head toward him, her eyes narrowing. He was seated 2 rows back, his posture rigid with agitation. His flushed face and entitled demeanor mirrored his earlier confrontation with her. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, glancing his way but saying nothing. Leah hesitated. She didn't want to escalate the situation, but his blatant disregard for the skill of the crew struck a nerve. Exhaling softly, she decided to speak, her tone firm but measured. "They do train for this," she said, turning to face him. "Trust me. Pilots handle worse than this every day." The man's head snapped toward her, his glare sharp and accusatory. "And how would you know?" he shot back, his words dripping with skepticism. Leah didn't flinch. Her tone remained steady, her gaze unwavering. "Because I've flown in situations far worse than this," she replied. "And I've seen pilots navigate conditions you couldn't imagine. This turbulence might feel unsettling, but it's not dangerous." For a moment, the man seemed caught off guard, his expression flickering between anger and embarrassment. He opened his mouth to retort but thought better of it, leaning back into his seat with a huff. The cabin remained tense, like static in the air, but Leah noticed some passengers visibly relaxing, reassured by her calm authority. The turbulence eased gradually, the plane's movements becoming gentler until it finally steadied. A collective murmur of relief passed through the cabin, and the flight attendants resumed their rounds, offering smiles and reassurances. Leah turned back to the elderly woman beside her, who now wore a faint but grateful smile. "Thank you, dear," the woman said, her voice shaky but sincere. "I don't know what I'd have done without you." Leah returned the smile warmly. "No need to thank me. You're stronger than you think." As the cabin settled into an uneasy calm, Leah relaxed slightly, her grip on the armrest loosening. Her eyes drifted toward the man across the aisle, who now stared out the window, his jaw clenched. Leah wasn't sure if her words had reached him, but she let it go. She had done what she could, for the passengers, for herself. Leaning back into her seat, she gazed out at the clouds, their serene appearance a stark contrast to the turbulence they had just endured. It reminded her of something her mentor had once told her during her first deployment. Even in turbulence, the sky above remains calm. Focus on that, and you'll find your way through. Leah closed her eyes, letting the memory guide her thoughts. The plane was steady now, its path unwavering, and so was she. As the plane touched down, a collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. Leah felt the faint tremor of the landing gear against the runway and exhaled softly. The flight was over, but a lingering tension remained, unspoken, unresolved. She glanced at her backpack, where the envelope rested, ready to serve as a bridge she wasn't certain would be crossed. Passengers shuffled to their feet as the seatbelt light clicked off, the familiar chaos of retrieving bags and belongings commencing. Leah stayed seated, letting the commotion pass her by. Her gaze fell on the man a few rows ahead, now standing and retrieving his luggage. His movements were deliberate, his posture rigid, yet the faint lines of weariness etched into his face didn't escape her notice. When the aisle cleared enough for her to stand, Leah reached into her bag and pulled out the envelope. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them as the man adjusted his suit jacket. His eyes met hers, his brow furrowing slightly. "Sir," Leah said, extending the envelope, her tone measured and calm, "I'd like you to read this when you have a moment." He hesitated, his gaze flicking between her face and the envelope, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Why?" he asked, his tone skeptical. "So you can lecture me." Leah's hand remained steady, the envelope held out like an offering. "No," she said simply, "so you can understand." For a moment he didn't move, his hesitation palpable. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he took the envelope, slipping it into the inside pocket of his jacket without another word. He turned and walked down the aisle, his steps brisk yet deliberate. Leah watched him go, her expression unreadable, but her resolve unwavering. Later, in the bustling terminal, Leah stood near the baggage carousel, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Around her, the noise was a symphony of voices, families reuniting, travelers rushing, and crackling PA announcements. She scanned the crowd absently, her thoughts drifting to the letter. Would he read it? Would it matter? As if summoned by her thoughts, the man appeared through the throng of people. His pace was slower now, his shoulders less stiff. When he reached her, Leah noticed the subtle shift in his demeanor. The sharpness from earlier was gone, replaced by something softer, something vulnerable. His eyes, rimmed with exhaustion, met hers, and for the first time he seemed to see her as more than just a uniform. "I read it," he said, his voice quieter than she expected. He paused, searching for the right words. "I didn't expect to feel this way." Leah tilted her head slightly, her curiosity tempered with patience. "What do you mean?" she asked gently. The man swallowed hard, his gaze dropping briefly before meeting hers again. "I lost my brother in Afghanistan," he said, the words heavy with unspoken grief. "He was my hero. And when I saw you, sitting there in first class, I don't know, I just felt angry. Like you were a reminder of what I lost." Leah's stance softened, the pieces of his story falling into place. The pain in his voice, the tension in his actions. It all made sense now. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a quiet weight. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said sincerely. "Truly." The man nodded, his lips pressing together as he composed himself. "He always talked about people like you, his unit, his brothers and sisters in arms, how much you meant to him. I think I forgot that somewhere along the way. I let the grief blind me." Leah's eyes softened, her tone steady yet compassionate. "Grief does that," she said. "It makes us lash out, sometimes at people who don't deserve it. But I hope you see now, what we do out there, we do for everyone. No matter where we come from, no matter what our stories are." The man nodded again, his shoulders slumping slightly, as though a weight had been lifted. "I do," he said quietly. "I see that now, and I'm sorry for how I acted." Leah offered a small, reassuring smile. Apology accepted. For a moment they stood in silence, the cacophony of the terminal fading into the background. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photo, his hand trembling slightly. "This is him," he said. "Jack. He'd have admired you, I think. He would have wanted me to say thank you." Leah accepted the photo gently, her eyes scanning the image of a young man in uniform, his smile wide and genuine. Her chest tightened, a bittersweet ache swelling within her. "He looks like he was a good man," she said, handing the photo back. "Thank you for sharing this with me." The man offered a faint smile, the first genuine one she'd seen from him. "Safe travels, Sergeant Matthews," he said, his tone sincere. "And to you," Leah replied, watching as he turned and disappeared into the crowd. For a moment she stood there, the exchange lingering in her mind, a reminder of the connections forged in the unlikeliest of circumstances. Adjusting the strap of her backpack, she took a deep breath, ready to face what lay ahead. The cafe was quiet, a small pocket of calm within the bustling terminal. Leah sat across from David at a corner table near the large windows overlooking the runways. The soft clinking of cups and distant murmurs filled the space, but Leah's focus remained on the man in front of her. His demeanor was different now, open and raw instead of defensive. David stirred his coffee absently, his gaze fixed on the swirling liquid as if it held answers. "I've spent so many years trying to make sense of it," he began, his voice low and thoughtful. "Jack, my brother, he was everything to me. He was younger by 3 years, but braver than anyone I've ever known. The one who always stepped up when it mattered." Leah nodded, her own coffee untouched. She could feel the weight of his words, heavy with grief and regret. David's eyes met hers briefly before darting away. "When he didn't come back, it felt like my world flipped upside down. I kept asking myself why. Why him? Why not me? And when I saw you on that plane," he paused, his hand tightening around his coffee cup, "it brought everything back." Leah leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but steady. "Grief does that," she said. "It sneaks up on you in ways you don't expect. But it's not just a reminder of what you lost. It's also a reminder of what you still carry with you. Jack's courage, his love for others, like me. That's still with you." Jack said. David nodded slowly, his expression reflective. Leah offered a faint but genuine smile. "It's not easy," she said. "Out there, we don't have the luxury of dividing ourselves by what we think makes us different. My best friend Maria was Latina. Ahmed, our interpreter, risked his life for us every day. None of that mattered in the field. We were family. We looked out for each other, because that's what you do when everything else falls away." David looked up at her, visibly moved. The sharpness in his expression had softened, replaced by quiet introspection. "I've been blind, haven't I?" he asked, his voice tinged with self-awareness. "Jack always told me to see people for who they are, not what I think they are. But instead, I've held on to bitterness and let it cloud my judgment." Leah took a small sip of her coffee, her fingers brushing the warm ceramic. "You're not alone in that," she said. "We all have blind spots. What matters is what we do once we see them." David exhaled deeply, leaning back in his chair as though shedding a heavy weight. "It's strange," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Talking with you about Jack. It's the closest I've felt to him in years." Leah smiled back, a quiet understanding passing between them. "Sometimes it takes a stranger to remind us of what we already know," she said. "Jack sounds like someone who brought people together. Maybe he's still doing that." David chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Maybe he is," he said. "He'd probably be laughing at me right now, telling me to stop being such a stubborn old man." Leah's laughter joined his, lightening the air between them. For a moment, it felt as though they were old friends rather than strangers brought together by chance. The tension and misunderstanding from earlier seemed like a distant memory. As their conversation wound down, David reached into his pocket and placed the photograph of Jack on the table between them. His fingers lingered on the edges before he spoke. "Keep this," he said quietly. "I think Jack would have wanted you to have it." Angling his head, Leah hesitated, her hand hovering over the photo. It felt like more than a simple gesture. It was a connection to something greater than both of them. Finally, she took it, her touch gentle as she studied Jack's face again. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I'll take good care of it." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Sergeant Matthews. he said. For everything. Leah met his gaze, her own filled with quiet determination. Call me Leah, she said. And you're welcome. As they stood to leave, the moment lingered, a quiet understanding passing between them. Leah watched as David walked away, his posture lighter, his steps more purposeful. She tucked the photograph into her bag, her mind already turning toward the future. This was a new beginning, not just for David, but for Leah as well. It reminded her of why she served, why she endured, and why she would continue to bridge divides, one step at a time. The crisp Chicago evening greeted Leah as she stepped out of the cab, her boots crunching softly against the gravel of her family's driveway. The warm glow of the porch light illuminated the familiar contours of the modest house she had grown up in. She stood still for a moment, letting the sight wash over her. From the weathered wooden steps to the wind chimes swaying gently in the breeze, every detail felt like a piece of a life she had longed to reconnect with. Before she could take another step, the front door swung open. Her mother appeared, her face lighting up with a mixture of joy and relief. "Leah," she called, arms outstretched. Leah barely had time to set her bag down before she was enveloped in her mother's embrace. The familiar scent of lavender and baking spices wrapped around her like a warm blanket. Moments later, her father appeared, his steps slower but no less eager. He placed a firm, reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's good to have you back," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Leah smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "It's good to be back," she replied softly. Inside, the house was just as she remembered. Cozy, filled with framed photos and the soft hum of a jazz tune on the radio. As they settled into the living room, her mother handed her a cup of tea and sat beside her, her eyes perceptive. "Something happened, didn't it?" her mother asked gently. Leah hesitated, her fingers curling around the warm mug. "Yeah," she said eventually, her voice contemplative. "On the flight, there was a situation." She recounted the confrontation with the man on the plane, the turbulence, and the letter she had written. She spoke of the unexpected connection with David over coffee, his grief over his brother, and the bridge they had built in the process. Her parents listened intently, the weight of her story settling over the room like a quiet mist. When she finished, her father leaned back in his chair, his expression both proud and pensive. "You handled it with more grace than most would," he said. "It's not easy to meet someone's anger with understanding, but you did. I'm proud of you." Her mother nodded, resting a hand on Leah's arm. "It sounds like you reminded him of something important," she said softly. "And maybe reminded yourself too." Leah smiled faintly, her gaze drifting to the photograph in her pocket. "I think I did," she admitted. "Sometimes we just need to see each other for who we are, not who we assume each other to be." Her father nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's a lesson worth carrying forward." The evening passed with memories, laughter, and quiet reflection. For Leah, it wasn't just a return to her family. It was a reminder of the strength she had gained, not just on the battlefield, but from the connections she had learned to foster. The auditorium buzzed with quiet anticipation as the audience filled the rows. A sea of faces turned toward the stage. Leah stood backstage, adjusting the microphone pinned to her jacket. The room was vast, but the intimacy of the moment wasn't lost on her. This wasn't a battlefield, yet it felt like one. A place where change could be sparked and understanding forged. When her name was called, the applause was warm and welcoming. Leah stepped forward, the spotlight catching the subtle gleam of her uniform as she approached the podium. Her gaze swept over the crowd, pausing on a familiar face in the front row. David sat there, his posture attentive, his expression calm but supportive. She gave him a small nod before addressing the audience. "We all carry prejudices," she began, her voice steady and resonant. "Sometimes they're quiet, hidden in the corners of our minds. Other times they're loud, shaping our actions and judgments. But whether they're spoken or silent, they have the power to divide us, if we let them. A hush settled over the room, the weight of Leah's words lingering in the stillness. She continued, her tone shifting from reflective to resolute. What I've learned, both overseas and here at home, is that we have the power to confront our prejudices, to question them, challenge them, and ultimately overcome them. We can choose to build bridges, not walls. She paused, letting the audience absorb her words, then shared her story. Leah spoke of her unit, the bonds forged in the crucible of service that transcended race, religion, and background. She spoke of Maria, whose bravery had left an indelible mark on her, and of Ahmed, whose sacrifices reminded her of the humanity that connected them all. Finally, she recounted her encounter with David on the plane, framing it not as a conflict but as a shared transformation. When we take the time to see each other, not just the labels or assumptions but the people, we create space for something extraordinary. Understanding, Leah said, her voice tinged with hope. And that understanding can lead to change. Her eyes found David in the front row. His expression was thoughtful, his nod subtle but full of meaning. Their connection was a testament to the power of confronting bias with empathy and dialogue. Kate watched David for several moments, waiting for him to speak. The audience erupted into applause, but Leah didn't see it as an ending. It was a beginning. As she stepped back from the podium, she felt the weight of the moment, but also the clarity of her purpose. As the applause subsided, David approached her. "You've got a gift," he said, his voice filled with respect. Jack would have been proud. "I know I am." Leah smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," she replied. "But this isn't just about me. It's about all of us finding a way to do better, together." David nodded, and as they parted ways, Leah felt a renewed sense of mission. The bridges she had begun to build weren't just personal. They were a call to action, showing the world that understanding was possible, even in the face of division. She was ready to keep building, one story, one conversation, one connection at a time. The crowd thinned, the echo of applause fading as people lingered in small groups, their voices low and contemplative. Leah stood near the stage, reflecting on the speech. It had been more than just words. It had been a release, a culmination of lessons learned and scars carried. David approached quietly, holding something in his hand. When he reached her, he extended a photo, worn at the edges but vibrant with life. "This is Jack," he said, his voice steady yet emotional. "He would have admired you. Everything you said up there. It's what he believed in. Thank you for reminding me of that." Leah took the photo gently, her fingers brushing its edges. The young man in the picture radiated warmth, his smile unguarded and genuine. Her throat tightened as grief and gratitude washed over her. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "For sharing him with me, and for reminding me why I serve." David nodded, his own eyes glistening. "You've given me something I didn't know I needed," he admitted. "Perspective. And hope." Leah offered a faint but genuine smile. "That's what Jack gave you," she said. "I'm just helping you remember." As David walked away, blending into the departing crowd, Leah slipped the photo into her pocket. Its weight was grounding yet uplifting, a reminder of the connections that shaped her mission. Stepping outside into the crisp night air, Leah paused under the wide expanse of stars. Her thoughts lingered on Jack's photo, the stories of Maria and Ahmed, and the lessons she had learned. Each moment reminded her that understanding wasn't easy, but it was essential. Empathy, even in the face of pain, could transform hearts. Her journey had taught her that the work of building bridges wasn't finished. Prejudices would linger and conflicts would arise, but even the smallest moments of understanding could ripple outward, touching lives unseen. Leah reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the photo, and smiled quietly. The work isn't finished, she thought, but neither am I. Walking forward into the night, Leah carried Jack's memory, David's gratitude, and her own renewed purpose. The questions she left behind in that auditorium about empathy, connection, and the courage to confront division would echo long after the doors closed. And that was exactly as it should be.